Question on affordability, cost of living, inflation. Obviously, there was coronavirus, and then now there is the war in Ukraine.
Yeah.
Fuel prices, price of food, everything is on the rise.
Yeah.
How does one from a simple house without a rich background or enormous yearly salary, how does one live in the UK anymore? And how can you have a good standard of life in the UK?
And it is really hard for huge numbers of people because of the cost of living crisis. Things like the rate of inflation of products like bread or dairy products that are everyday things, everyday necessities, is enormous. And it's all linked back to both the war, to a certain extent, to the supply chain crisis following, disruptions of supply chains following the coronavirus crisis, and what I think is needed is some action on energy costs as a first vital step on this. And I do think that we've got some great ideas that would make a really big difference to most people. So you probably saw that Keir announced a few days ago that a Labour government would keep a ceiling on the energy prices. That would make a massive difference to people. It'd be paid for from a windfall tax on energy producers. We've already announced the windfall tax. We just roll it out a bit further. They're making vast and unexpected profits. The companies hadn't expected to get this money, and the consumers are suffering equally a vast impact because of the rising price. So it would be a fairer solution, one that also, the calculations show, would reduce inflation overall by about 4%, because obviously the rising price of energy is one of the biggest contributing factors to inflation. And a lot of the price rises in things like food or other goods or services are linked to the greater cost of transporting goods, or the cost of gas for other purposes used in businesses, whether it's to heat them or in some other way. So I think that's a really sensible policy which will help. I'd also like to add that at a local level, I think there are two things here. One is to have competent national policies, and I think that's an excellent policy, the one that we announced recently. But also at a local level, it's really important to be available to help your constituents. And one of the things we were doing in the campaign day this week in South Reading was to talk to community groups about how they can support the most vulnerable people. And I do quite a bit of work on that. And I'm also available if anybody needs help and they would like some support in asking for additional funding. There is already a scheme run by the energy companies where people in really dire straits can ask for help paying their bills. I mean, it's for a relatively small number of people, but in some exceptional cases that can be arranged as well. So I'd also just like to remind constituents that exists.
Isn't it obvious though, Matt, where if the energy companies like Shell and BP, they're making enormous profit. This is in billions. And then you have a consumer that is paying crazy amount of price just for the litre of petrol or diesel.
Yeah.
Where does government come? Shouldn't government be the mediator in the person in the middle, where they should be telling the companies enough is enough? You can't keep raising the cost, and any extra cost that's obviously, rise of cost is dependent on war. It could be supply chain issues, whatever. But shouldn't government be absorbing all the cost, and it shouldn't be 100% flown down to the consumer?
Well, you're hinting at the scheme that we've announced. So we'd put a cap on the level of increase over the winter to give people reassurance, and we'd fund that by rolling out the windfall tax on energy companies.
Which is taxing the companies.
The companies,
the big
and helping the consumer.
And why isn't that being done already anyway? Because of
I think the current government, unfortunately, have shied away from doing that. And we've made that point for several months, been making that point since January. And obviously the price has been increasing for several months as the war's rolled out. Some of those months are the cold months of the year when people use more fuel anyway. And the government have ignored those pleas, unfortunately. They've not listened to what we've been saying. And it's not just us, it's other consumer experts, people like Martin Lewis from Money Saving Expert. Charities have been making points. The government, sadly, have ignored a range of calls for change. They did belatedly come up with a scheme that would offer some help, but they did it in a way that disproportionately affected some wealthier people.
It's always the case, isn't it? It's always
Well, it was a really serious mistake. So what they've done is they've offered extra help to based on the number of properties that you own. So if you're a homeowner and you own a holiday house somewhere, you not only get help to pay the bills in your original house where you live most of the time, but they've quite wrongly offered help for the second property as well, rather than trying to do something that's fair and across the board for everyone. And I do think that our approach is much better and it's fairer, and it's interesting that opinion polls show that the public are much more interested in the kind of approach that we've come up with. They think it's fairer and more effective, and it is.
And why is it always the medium class people that get hit by raising taxes? And obviously the richer are always getting richer. Rich people are getting richer. And the medium or the medium wage people are always paying high taxes. And it's a scheme that it's not just the Conservative and in the past Labour as well, we've seen that as well. Why is it always the medium class people that have to pay for everything? And why is it that richer or rich people get away with, they say it's an investment. There's always a loophole for rich people. And how would you, what's your commentary on that, and how would you address that?
Well, I think we should be trying to have a fairer society where people with the broadest shoulders make the biggest contribution. And, we have called for that type of an approach where there would be a fair contribution from a range of people and a range of organisations. So in this case, the energy companies are very wealthy. The consumers have been absolutely battered by rising prices. And what we're saying is we'd like to see a sensible approach where very wealthy companies who've had a surprising windfall. I mean, one of the directors of BP described his company as a cash machine earlier this year. So they've had this surprising and very unexpected windfall, and we just think it's fair to tax that and use the money to offer a better deal to the majority of people. And that just seems to me to be a fair approach.
Is that a temporary solution, or is that going to go ahead with the Labour's policy in the future as well?
The scheme we've announced for the moment is for 6 months. So obviously that would help over the winter. Emphasis in the longer term on other things as well. So we've also announced this massive energy programme as well of insulation and so on. So that's £28 billion a year on environmentally friendly measures, some of which would include household insulation. And so there's a twin track approach there really. And I think it's important to look at the cause of the problem as well in the longer term. And our housing stock is not as well insulated as in some colder countries. And obviously that's a historical thing. It's to do with the British climate. Obviously in countries like Canada or even Germany, where the winters are harsher, for many, many years, there's been a greater level of insulation. And we need to try and catch up with that and try and help people get through the winter and reduce the overall heating bills in the longer term.
And it's a 6-month solution for going forward for now.
Yeah.
Why can't that be a permanent solution? Why can't this windfall tax be a forever solution where you tax the rich and the richer company?
I think the important thing to recognise is this is a solution for the immediate crisis. That's the key thing. We're in a crisis. People need help and some security over the winter. There's enormous concern about the cost of these bills and the possibility also, the likelihood that without a scheme like this, people's bills could rise a number of times during the winter. So what we're offering is certainty for the foreseeable future and then some long-term measures to change the whole dynamic of the way that people pay to make sure that their bills go down in the longer term by having greater insulation. So I think it's a sensible plan and it's what's needed at the moment, and it's in contrast to what the governments are offering, where they've not really provided something that's as comprehensive for such a large number of people. Their plans wouldn't also reduce inflation in the same way, and they're not giving so much certainty to people. And in addition, then also not investing in insulation in the way that's really necessary, as you've hinted at earlier in your questions.